Right, we'll start kicking off, and hopefully our speakers are going to come through the door. So Clive is running about 10 minutes late, and it's about 10 past, so hopefully he should be coming. Oh, Lisa's arriving as we speak, so that's fantastic. So, so that's great. Welcome, Lisa. We've only just started, so, well, literally just started, so it's great. Right, so thank you everyone for coming, and clearly, I mean, there's a load of people here, so that's fantastic, and sorry it's a bit cramped. We thought we had a very big room, but clearly we didn't. So I'm Jake Sumner, I'm one of the SERA co-chairs, and you're at the Green Revolution. How will the Treasury tackle the environmental and climate emergency with SERA and Greener UK? If you thought you were at another event, please stay, because it will be better than the one you thought you were going to go to. And just for the format, we'll be hearing from our speakers shortly, and then open up to questions, and we'll be trying to be wrapped up, well, we must be wrapped up no later than 4:15. So we need a rapid response to climate change, we need to have rapid speeches and a quick and sharp event for an hour. The event is being filmed and streamed, and it will be on our website afterwards, so don't hold back on any points, but be aware that the audience will be more than this room. And on that note, please can you tweet at hashtag climate crisis, hashtag Lab19 that everyone is doing, but also hashtag SERA Lab19. Right, got that right. So just a little bit about SERA. Some of you may know about SERA, but it's Labour's environment campaign, and we're independent but linked to the Labour Party. We run events, we run like this and others. We run campaigns. We try and shape the party's policy and work across all levels in the party. And we produce New Ground, copies of our magazine, which is around here, and we have a blog, etc., and work with a group of MPs as well, and there's an ever-growing number of SERA MPs in the network. So please come to the rest of our programme. It's probably the largest of any single organisation, I think, and reflects probably the interest and concern of the climate emergency that we face. All the events, bar one, are in here, and details on the leaflets. And also, please join SERA if you aren't a member. So I also want to thank Greener UK, our partners for this event, so thank you for them, and Fanny will be speaking a bit more from their perspective. So just on that, just a little bit of a brief context for this event. The conference is perhaps one of the most important we've held, and a big focus is clearly on climate change and the climate emergency that we face. And we are at a crisis point. Change is needed across all policy areas and rapidly. So how does that happen? As we know, the Treasury in this country is extremely powerful, perhaps too powerful, and I know from working as a special advisor in the last Labour government, and it controls all the purse strings. Yet the Treasury hasn't always been, and is now, a strong driver of a green agenda, and the Green Book clearly doesn't live up to the name of that. So we're looking at some of that today in this discussion, and as the Treasury oversees the economic and financial systems, again, which are key for the changes we need, we'll be looking at that. And one thing we've been arguing for in SERA is a climate emergency spending review to look at all the governments and programmes and policies through a carbon lens, and to help us to move to net zero as quickly as possible. And it's one idea that we should be adopting, and you're going to hear many more today, but clearly that's something that we need to press the government to do now. They're not doing it, and it shows a credible response to the emergency we face. So that's enough from me for a bit of a context. I was going to bring in Fanny first, and can you just give your thoughts on the context that we just set out?
Thanks very much, and thanks for having us, and thanks for partnering with Greener UK. I'm Fanny Calder. I am the Director of Campaigns and Public Affairs at WWF-UK. I'm here partly to speak in that role, and partly to also represent Greener UK, which is a group of the 13 biggest environment organisations in the UK that came together in the context of the Brexit debate to try and ensure that whatever happens with Brexit, we don't, is that echoing terribly? That we don't lose our ability to protect and restore nature and the environment. We represent 8 million members in total. But I'm also a climate campaigner who has been working to try and raise these issues up the agenda for my entire adult life, for 30 years. And I have to say, this is amazing. The fact that this conference is taking climate with the seriousness that it deserves is phenomenally exciting. What I think my key message today is that we've also got to take the nature crisis with that much seriousness. And when we're talking about Treasury policy and policy across the board, we've got to see the climate crisis and the nature crisis as the same, as very, very interlinked crises. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We very much hope that what's happening in conference this week means that nature and climate are going to be major electoral issues, and we very much hope that all parties will be competing to show that they are serious about tackling this problem. And I think one thing to say to start off with is that WWF has worked with others to try and cost what a proper response to the emergency might look like. And what our figures show, based on the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations, that we're looking at something like 5% of government spending for the next 10 years. And I think one of the things we get in the climate debate is this sense that we're thinking about, is it 2030, is it 2045, is it 2050? For the record, we say 2045. At WWF, we've done a report that shows that's credible and possible. I totally appreciate the urgency of those who want to say earlier, but I think the point is urgency. It's about what do we do now? And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. So we think nature should be at the heart of the climate agenda. And I would say that I think actually we think it's, in a way, it's the soul of the climate agenda. Quite a lot of what we need to do on climate change is very technical. We need that. We need the changes to mean things to people. We need them to relate to them. We need them to absolutely to feel that their lives are different and better. And in some ways, that will be warmer homes. In some ways, that will be electric cars. But it will also be, we hope, that nature is abundant across our country. And that we know that there's huge mental health benefits, there's huge physical health benefits, and there's also huge benefits to nature. If we have more nature, if we connect up ecosystems, we can allow nature to adapt to climate change, which is driving it north. And if it can't move north because there's no nature in between one patch and another, then things can't evolve, can't respond. So I think that's the sort of vision that we want to share with you. I think in thinking about that vision, we also need to think about the fact just how much nature we've already lost. We're talking here about the Green Industrial Revolution. I think that the previous Industrial Revolution, along with the revolution in agriculture, is absolutely the main driver of nature loss. We are now, in the world, the 189th most nature-depleted country in the world. We have lost most of our nature. 1 in 7 species is at risk of extinction. And that doesn't just matter to the nature that we love, it very much matters to us. It's going to affect our ability to grow food. It's going to affect our ability to survive climate change because nature plays a huge role in managing flood risk and so on. But it also affects our ability to absorb carbon and to balance the emissions that we're still committed to making. So that's the agenda. We need to bring nature back if we're going to tackle the climate emergency. And what's really interesting is that we need to bring biodiverse nature back. It's not just about tree planting. What we need is proper ecosystems because they are much more resilient and they actually absorb more carbon. So the nature, as I say, the nature and the climate emergency really do fit together like that. But to get to specifics, what is it that in terms of policy, in terms of what we'd want Treasury, in terms of what we want government to do, we think that it's really, really important that whether or not we Brexit, that we set targets for the restoration of nature. We need those to be legislated targets so that we are really committed as a country to bringing nature back. And those targets should absolutely be a part of a broader climate package and they should play their role in that. We think that those targets should include the networks, nature highways to connect nature across the country, but also to connect people to nature so that communities can actually benefit as we bring nature back. We think we need a proper oversight of whether we're actually delivering those targets and whether, more generally, whether we're protecting the environment, whether we're protecting nature. At the moment, our watchdogs, our existing watchdogs, are incredibly weak. If we come out of the EU, we will lose most of our ability to challenge the government on whether it's protecting nature or not. So we need a watchdog that has teeth, that has funding, that has the ability to really enforce its decisions. At the moment, we have none of that, and that's one of the reasons that the trends are so bad. But we also, and really at the kind of absolute heart of the transformation for nature in this country, is the transformation for agriculture. we need our agriculture system to completely transform. And we already, the Tory government has looked at this to some extent, and there's been a big discussion about using agricultural subsidy to actually subsidise public goods, so to subsidise nature rather than just to subsidise people because they happen to have some land and are farming on it. And we think that that should be the jewel in the crown. And why that matters is because if we don't transform agriculture, we will continue to destroy nature. Because if we do transform agriculture, we can start to address to bring nature back in a way and do agriculture in a way that's incredibly that absorbs carbon. But also because we've seen the Amazon fires recently. The reason those fires are burning is because of unsustainable agriculture. We really need to lead the world towards a future where we are not farming in an unsustainable way. And we have the potential in this country, if we commit to using the subsidy that we currently pay farmers to farm unsustainably, to paying them to bring back nature, to restore nature, we can stand up in many of the big meetings that are happening next year, big international meetings, and say, look, we're leading the way, we're serious about this, and we want to support you with overseas development assistance, with technical support to actually transform agriculture in ways that means that the people in the Amazon who are cutting down, who are burning the forest in order to farm, they need a sustainable livelihood, and we can support them if we fund this transition. Thank
you. Thank you for that. We're going to hand over to Lisa Nandy now, who is a former Shadow Energy and Climate Change Secretary and has spoken at a number of SERA events before, and you're very welcome to give your thoughts.
Great stuff. Thanks very much. Sorry I was late. Not as late as Clive Lewis, which is par for course. I'm a former Shadow Energy and Climate Secretary. It turns out there are quite a lot of us about, but you've got me today. And the reason that I was so keen to be here is because I'm finding politics quite hard at the moment. We've got so many divisions. There are divisions taking place at this conference. There are divisions out in the country. The threat of no deal is looming. We've got Boris Johnson in charge of the country. But something happened recently that just really, really inspired me, and that was the sight of young people marching, taking to the streets in order to express the urgency that they feel about climate change. And it was quite spectacular because it forced Brexit off the political agenda for a few merciful days. And it forced politicians to respond. So there are lots of politicians like Ed Miliband, Caroline Lucas, who talk about climate change a lot, but for the rest of us, it meant that suddenly this thing had to go right up our political agenda. And we were talking about it again for the first time in ages. And I've learned in 10 years in Parliament that that is part of the problem, is that the urgent, the immediate always takes priority, and issues like climate change get kicked into the long grass. It's been very rare until relatively recently for climate change to come up on the doorstep. So when you've got a clamour of noise for your attention, it always gets pushed right down to the bottom of people's priorities list. And I've learnt, therefore, that if change is going to come, it's not going to come from the inside. It's going to come from people taking a stand, making their voices heard outside. You know, I was asked the other day, shouldn't those children be in school? And of course, love to see children in school, which is where a lot of this revolution is coming from, through education about the climate emergency. But actually, we have to recognise that this was a moment as a country where those young people stood up and said, this has got to change. And we've got to seize that moment, and we've got to do our best with it. But if we're going to seize that moment, then we've got to live up to the scale of the challenge that they've thrown at us. And it's time for a level of seriousness about the climate debate from all sides. I am really worried that what is happening with climate change is that it's becoming a culture war in the way that Brexit has become a culture war as well, and is polarised into those who are for and those who are against, and we cannot afford for it to happen. So for some people, that means getting real about the scale of the risks and the need for a transition that is as sweeping and rapid as possible. And I'll be honest with you, I have mixed feelings about moving the target to 2030, because I don't even think we're putting the plans in place to meet the target in 2050, and I really want to see us talking about that. But I welcome the sentiment behind it, which is that this is urgent and that more needs to be done, and it has to be at the top of our priorities. But that will mean making the right choices as well about energy and transport infrastructure. I really welcome the announcement that came out of the Labour front bench this week about electric cars, and I'd really like to see more of that, but I'd particularly like to see that extended to areas that are completely neglected by most of the political class, and that is buses, where most people spend time, the mode of transport that is most used by people out there. You wouldn't know it to listen to the debate in Westminster about high speed 2, but buses are absolutely key. And I said this before, but I'll say it again, it's buses, not Brexit, that are going to determine the outcome of the next election. So if we want to tackle climate change and we want to get a Labour government elected that can do it, then thinking about how we can drive this clean energy revolution through our transport system is really, really important. But it also means that we've got to face up to some tough choices. And the honest truth for my party is that you cannot declare a climate emergency and continue to support airport expansion. It's just completely incompatible. And to my friends in the trade union movement, it's also an invitation, a plea really, to organise. When I was the Shadow Energy Secretary, we had a crisis in the British steel industry, and it dominated, rightly, Parliament for several days. But around the same time, the government was cutting the feed-in tariffs for solar, and we saw massive, widespread, sweeping job losses in the solar industry, bigger than the job losses in steel. But it didn't dominate the headlines, and it didn't take over Parliament for days. Why was that? Well, one of the reasons was that the unions are in a really effective lobbying force, but those solar workers weren't in a trade union, and so their voices quite simply weren't heard. So we've got to start organising out there in the country as well if we want to make this a priority. And for other people, for those, my friends who've been pushing very hard to get us to go further and faster on climate change over the last few days, sitting in about 40 hours of composite meetings, trying to get the wording right on our motion, I would just say this as well, is that we've got to get serious about the need to take people with us. Because, you know, when I first took on the brief in the Shadow Cabinet, I talked to a lot of friends and colleagues in London who were saying, you know, tackling climate change, top of the priority list, absolute emergency, got to do whatever it takes. And then I went home to Wigan and I talked to a lot of my constituents about what they felt about climate change, and it was two things. It was my energy bill's going to go up and my jobs just disappeared. Now, we've got to turn this into a positive agenda and take people with us, or we're not going to win. And one of the mistakes that I think we made in government was, and you know, I'm proud of what people like Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown did under the last Labour government, the world's first ever Climate Change Act, and all the priority and action that went alongside it. But we loaded the cost of those clean energy schemes onto the poorest. By putting the cost onto energy bills rather than in general taxation, we left the poorest paying 6 times the wealthiest to tackle climate change. It's not acceptable and it won't work. And so we've got to think seriously about how we cut emissions more quickly, but in a just and strategic way. There is no point in telling people in Wigan to get out of their cars when the bus network has been destroyed and the trains have ground to a halt. We haven't had a functioning train service in the northwest of England for about 2 years now, and people have no option but to get into their cars. Many of my constituents have bought cars as a consequence. So why aren't we making common cause with the Better Buses campaigners so that we're tackling climate change, but we're also showing people that this isn't a threat, this is a chance to remake Britain and improve people's quality of life. You know, when I look at where that's happened in the last few years, it's been Labour councils who've been doing it. So in Warrington, they set up a huge solar scheme on one of their council estates, and they created apprenticeships for young people off the estates to go and do that work. They weren't just fitting the solar panels, but they were also educating people on that estate about how to best use energy, how to conserve energy, to reduce the demand, not just increase the supply. And it was brilliant to see it. You know, those young people were absolutely passionate, because what it gave them back was what was lost in my town when the mines were closed, which is jobs with a purpose that enable you to make a contribution. Within living memory, towns like Wigan were at the centre of the world. Wigan, Barnsley, we powered the world, and we helped to build this country's wealth and influence, the influence that helped us pave the way to Paris and to that landmark agreement that we reached a few years ago. And in those towns, at the moment, there is a resistance amongst some people to climate change. Why? Well, one of the reasons is we've got to change the language. So the phrase dirty coal is profoundly offensive to people in my town. Many people still live with the consequences of that really dangerous, difficult, dirty work down the mines. Got mesothelioma victims in Wigan who are still fighting for justice decades after the mines closed. So recognising and respecting the contribution that they made to this country is really important. And reparations for those towns after decades of neglect and underinvestment. You know, I went to Barnsley a few years ago, which is just like Wigan, where pride in the mining industry is palpable. You can almost reach out and touch it, but nobody wants that future for their children or their grandchildren. But they do want a better future than the one that is currently on offer, which is young people packing boxes in the largest employer, ASOS, for the minimum wage. And then I went over to Silicon Valley and saw how their federal government had used a combination of tax incentives for companies to come and invest in clean energy and some of the toughest environmental regulations in the world in order to get companies to come and develop clean energy there. And they've created apprenticeships so that their young people are designing the battery technology of the future, while our young people are assembling solar panels and packing boxes in ASOS. And why shouldn't young people in Barnsley power us through the next century, just like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last? That's the agenda that Labour needs to build, and that's the agenda that Labour needs to win. So I would just say to everyone here, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for shouting louder and forcing this issue onto the agenda. But now what we need is a plan. We need I don't want to hear about Brexit divisions, and I don't want to hear about factional divisions, because this is bigger than Brexit. This is about the future of the planet. And that means leaving aside our differences and starting to build common ground on this issue. And it means as well working and finding common cause with other political parties who share this agenda. Caroline Lucas is an ally in the fight for climate change, not an enemy. And we have to leave aside our differences and start to work together, because it'll take every tradition in our movement and the broadest coalition in this country in order to build the path to the change that we need to see. And there is a movement out there waiting to be built. You know, people forget, but one of the greatest achievements of Labour governments was the Parks movement. There is a really, really strong tradition in working class communities like mine across Britain that says clean air, green open spaces, nature, the environment, climate change, air pollution, all these things really, really matter. So let's remember that again. Let's get serious and let's get moving. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Next, we're going to hear from Martha McPherson, and she's the head of the Green Economy and Sustainable Growth at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. And I'll work a little bit with Martha, because I'm also a fellow there myself. So Martha is going to talk a little bit about green finance and how we green the financial industry and investment and all the rest of it. So Martha.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's so good to see such a crowded room. My name's Martha. I head up Green Economy and Sustainable Growth at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, or IIPP, to be quicker and shorter. And the work that we do at the Institute is rethinking economic models and innovation processes to tackle big societal challenges, of which climate change is the biggest. And to do so in a way that is inclusive and develops what we call public value, a new economic concept around developing value for everyone, value for all citizens. The Institute was set up a couple of years ago by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, whose book some of you may have read, who's done a lot of work on reorganizing and rethinking what counts for value in an economy, who's creating it, who's extracting it, and on the concept of the entrepreneurial state. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what that means for the climate crisis. And to get to kind of what Treasury needs to do, I think we need to take a step back and think about what the whole economy needs to do and how Treasury can support that. I mean, we're in a place where it can't be business as usual to hit targets like 2050 carbon neutrality, or like to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to reorient entirely all elements of the economy within a green direction. And the gap we need to fill is an innovation gap. not just a technological innovation gap. We actually are on the way in many ways to getting to greener technology. It's really nice to walk down West Street and see the Rampion offshore wind array and be reminded that actually technological elements are on the way to where we need them to be. But more like social innovation, management and organizational innovation. These are the things that we need to be investing in, and financial innovation as well. And this kind of cross-sector innovation needs everyone to come behind it. We need multi-actor approaches. We can't silo people. And we need to, as Lisa says, leave aside our differences both politically and the differences that exist between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society and the third sector. These elements all need to work together because the green transition just doesn't happen in a vacuum. Renewables alone or the waste sector alone cannot get us to a green transition purely through innovating in a complete and utter vacuum. And it can't just be led by industry either. We need citizens on board, we need trade unions aligned, and we need everyone at the table to design a green transition that we want, rather than have it handed down from above. So policies like industrial strategy, which I know was discussed here last night, cannot be a kind of vehicle for individual sectors. We can't be targeting specific sectors, automotives or aerospace or similar alone. Industrial strategy and other policies need to be challenge-led. They need to be governed by a long-term strategic mission. And missions need to be very long-term, very concrete, and outside of traditional political cycles. The climate crisis, solving the climate crisis, is a long-term mission. And this mission-oriented approach means not only working together, but actually creating a new market for the green transition. So it's not just that we sponsor individual initiatives that work together, but more that the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector create a market for the green transition to exist. This includes government. And missions, there's lots of different types of missions that you can that can be developed in order to think about the green transition. You can think about all the ocean plastic that we have and how much, taking percentage of it out of the ocean within the next 20 years. You can think about carbon neutrality mission, which is what we're talking about today. But in any case, you need to think about a long-term strategy. So at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, we're doing a lot of work on mission-oriented innovation. We're working with towns, we're working with cities, we're working with financial institutions, we're working with, in particular, the Scottish National Investment Bank, which in the recent programme for government set a 0% carbon. The Scottish National Investment Bank set up one of its key mission-oriented approaches to reach net zero carbon and support it as a financial institution. But currently, the evaluation and appraisal that governments use to look at new policy and existing policy are not ready for this mission-oriented approach. This is partly because evaluation and appraisal that currently exists is derived from a concept of market failure, the idea that governments should just exist to deal with the market failure, deal with negative externalities, and then let the private sector get on with all the exciting innovation and enterprise. And this is not how we see it at all. Instead of being seen as marginal and incremental, government policy, and based on allocative efficiency, the idea that with limited resources, we just need to put in place policy that gets the best value for money. We shouldn't be thinking about simply doing the bare minimum. We should be thinking about dynamic efficiency. The idea that within difficult and dynamic and changing grand challenges, like the climate crisis, things are changing so rapidly. The climate crisis is inherently dynamic. There are biophysical and social feedback loops that will happen over the next 10 to 20 years that we don't yet know anything about, that we can't predict and can't understand. So keeping in place static evaluation and appraisal policies like cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis within Treasury are not optimal for social outcomes, and they're not optimal for us to think about dynamic and changing systems. This is something that the Green Book says itself. It says thinking just about cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis can't get you the outcomes that you need in terms of social value. So thinking about this, we've got to a place where the tools that we currently have within the Green Book are not helpful either to measure the nature of the climate problem or to measure the solution, a kind of long-term cross-sector approach. So the Treasury is a very pivotal place to start thinking through, as you plan missions towards the green transition, how you measure these. It's very easy to pick out metrics specifically as a key area, but metrics are really just the cherry on the top of the cake for how the Treasury can start thinking about encouraging long-term mission approaches. So in terms of what the Treasury can do, I think there's a lot of innovation that can take place both within metrics and within wider support mechanisms. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and to hear thoughts from the panel.
Oh, thank you very much. So lastly, before we open it up to questions, we're going to hear from Clive, and Clive has been doing, he's a Shadow Treasury Minister, and he's been doing lots of work on looking at how to recalibrate and change the Treasury. And so, you know, hopefully he can reveal some juicy morsels today about how that institution can be changed and we can transform our society and economics.
Only John gets to tell you those. I don't get to tell you those. I mean, first of all, I mean, it is great to see probably the busiest room that I've been in this conference so far. And I think that says a lot about where we are on the whole climate and ecological collapse debate and discussion. I do very quickly just want to touch on something that Lisa said, and I don't want to make this about Europe. I'm not. I just want to get it done and said. But one of the main reasons why I hold the position that I do on remaining in the European Union is that if we accept that we have a decade to sort ourselves out, but we don't have a decade to sort ourselves out. We have months, really, if not a year or two, to begin the process. But 10 years to get our carbon output, our carbon footprint, and our ecological impacts within sustainable boundaries or on the path to that, then you begin to realize that whatever we do in this country alone isn't going to be enough. What we need is global leadership. And the only institution, the only mechanism that can do that at that scale, on an international scale, within the timescales we're talking, is a reformed and transformed European Union. And that's why, for me, this is about sequencing. I understand that climate change and ecological breakdown is the biggest existential threat facing humanity. United Kingdom leaving the EU is not going to have a massive impact on people in the Seychelles, but it will have a massive impact on our ability to play our part at an international level in the timescales required. And that is why I am fighting so hard to stay in the European Union, so we can have a voice and a vote and a veto if necessary on those international policies. And there's a key issue here. The two biggest lobbying capitals of the world are Washington and Brussels. And I think that tells you everything about where power lies on our planet. And that's why we need to be in there. So that's that first thing I wanted to get out of the way. The second thing is, I understand that we will have a debate. We will have, I believe, 2 composite motions on the Green New Deal. I've already put down a private member's bill with Caroline Lucas in that collaborative approach, because that ultimately, I think we all understand, Labour does not have all the answers when it comes to tackling the climate and ecological collapse that's facing us. But we can play a key and central part in that. But it's important that we're prepared to work with other people. Many of those youth climate strikers, much of the climate movement, are not part of the wider Labour movement. We want to see them work together, but we also have to understand that we're going to have to work collaboratively together if we're to have any chance in seeing the kind of policies that we need in the timescales we're talking. But my message is quite simple. When we had the debate in Parliament on the expansion of Heathrow, our party split. And I think that this has the potential. I don't want to see it become that, but I think the issue of ecology and climate change has the issue to be one of the new and large dividing lines, as Lisa spoke of, within the Labour movement. I hope it doesn't, but it has that potential. And we have to do all that we can to bring all parts of our movement together on the road to ensure that we are on the front foot on this issue. And what I said in that debate was, you can't negotiate with climate physics. You can't composite climate physics. They are what they are. And the challenge is quite simple. According to Professor Tim Jackson, the climate physics that face us is that to retain a 66, not even 100, a 66% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, the UK has a carbon budget of only 2.5 gigatons of CO2 for the remainder of this century. Now, at present, we use a production method of how to work out our carbon emissions. And in the UK, in 2018, we put out 364 megatons of carbon dioxide. That meant that on a production level basis, that means we don't include all our iPhones and everything that we export to other countries to produce. And as you probably know, over the last 30 years, we've outsourced a lot of our manufacturing capability to other countries. We don't even include that. The Climate Change Committee doesn't include this iPhone in the UK's carbon consumption. It's a production-based. And that means that with 364 megatons, we'll have used our budget by 2025. But if you have a consumption-based target, which is where I think the party is going to have to move to, then we basically hit our target, we basically exhaust our carbon budget in 3 years' time. Now, I would say that says to me that we're already on the wrong path, we're underestimating what we need to do, and we're already concerned about the amount of catch-up that we've got to enable. But if we go on to a consumption-based calculation, which is what is fair, that is our fair proportion, given the historical carbon that we have put into the atmosphere, then you see the challenge before us. So how are we going to be able to achieve this? Well, one of the things that I've been doing, and you touched on that, was one of the things that the Treasury team have been doing is that we've attempted to rewrite the Green Book, which is the kind of spending and lending Bible of the Treasury civil servants. And it's like a computer, and you kind of put in a request, can we have some billions of pounds for decarbonising our housing stock? And out the other end, because of the metrics, it will get a big fat raspberry, as things currently stand. So what we're trying to do, and what we have done in the paper that hasn't been published, but which has gone to the Treasury Permanent Secretary, is that we have begun to set out the priorities, the future priorities of a Labour government. So that the day that we come into power, and I hope that day is really soon, the day that we come into power, we can hit the ground running, because then they will have the bare necessities required to reprogram that computer, to reprogram those metrics, to make sure that inequality, climate change and ecological destruction, and stopping that are front and centre of how the Green Book operates. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we will need to, I think, begin to talk about carbon budgeting. Now, Greta Thunberg has talked about this, and ultimately, as I have said to a few front bench colleagues, you obsess now about how much money you'll be given from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and that's what you focus on, how much you'll get. But in the future, you should accept that it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to spend all that money if you don't have the appropriate carbon budgets within which to operate. And I'm pleased to say that both Angela Rayner, the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan, have all now begun to understand that actually the NHS is one of the biggest carbon emitters in the United Kingdom. Our education sector, what's the point of having our children learn about climate change when they're sat in schools generating hundreds of tons of carbon every year? We need to make sure that our public sector and our public services are also living within their means, and that then becomes an incentive for them to decarbonise and to put themselves on an ecological footing. Because if you haven't got that sorted out, if you're not living within your carbon budget, then that means that your budget is worth less. So that's one of the things that we're talking about. That's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. I think the other thing to talk about is the fact, and Lisa picked up on this, is that we are going to have to make sure that we begin to tackle the process of the fossil fuel industry. Now, I understand the whole concept of just transition. We're socialists. It's one of the reasons that we're not in the Green Party. We're in the Labour Party, because we understand the issue of our communities, of working people who have been treated appallingly across this country for the past 40 years. We want to put them front and centre of any ecological policy changes that we make. And there's a real key reason here why as socialists we will want to see an approach to tackling climate change. And you probably know these statistics, but I'll remind you of them. But we know both internationally and domestically, 50% of all the carbon and most of the commodities consumed within our economy are done by the top 10% within our society. And yet those at the bottom, 50%, consume only 10%. So then you begin to see that if we have carbon budgets that are going to shrink, there are limits to within which you can begin to change, because the poor can't give up what they don't consume. And that means that you then have to begin to redistribute within that carbon budget who is consuming and who isn't. And it is arguable that those at the bottom will consume more. We have to accept that. This is not about a trade-off so that those at the bottom have even less than they currently have now, so those at the top can continue consuming as they are. That isn't what the Labour Party is about. That isn't what our Treasury policy is about. So we will put social and economic justice at the heart of everything we do. The other thing I think I'll end on is aviation and shipping. I've heard some horror stories coming from Composite that there may be some trade-off, that we might accept the 2030 target, but we'll take out things like aviation and shipping. Those are the very issues that we need to confront head on. What's the point of taking out the mechanisms with which you are going to have to achieve a 2030 net zero target or zero target if you're taking out the very ability to be able to do that? And that means some tough questions. I have lots of people now who are talking about citizens' assemblies, about bringing people along with us. We are not communist China. We can't impose things on people. We've got to bring people along with us. Citizen assemblies may be a part of that. I know there's lots of work going on with it, but we as the Labour movement can also play our part in explaining to people that the Green New Deal and all that goes with that is a real opportunity, not a threat to your community, and that actually it's about Labour values at the heart of that Green New Deal, which means that we can sell that on the doorstep. Thank you.
So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. I'm probably going to take them in a series of 3 or 4s because there's already quite a lot of hands up. And then Lisa's already left. Thank you, Lisa, for that. Sorry out to Dash. But we've still got a great panel here as well. So without further ado, I will start on this side and we'll sort of work there and I'll work across this side.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your talks today. Ajay Lawalia, Streatham CLP, member of SERA, National Trust member, Friends of the Earth member, Greenpeace member. I think I've almost got bingo there. So 2 facts and a question. Number 1, 2030, we all know the targets associated with IPCC report and that there is a huge imperative and we are in a climate emergency. Second fact, specific details of the contract for difference round last week, where offshore wind energy is coming at less than £40, £39.5 per megawatt hour. We are, in the UK, world leaders. This is less than the wholesale price of energy. So my question, therefore, is nationalisation a distraction, nationalisation of the energy industry a distraction, when actually we just need to get on with the job and building as much renewable energy as possible?
Okay, thank you. And we'll take question at the back.
Hi, Robert McElveen from the Mineral Products Association, so we represent concrete, cement and aggregates. So really pleased to hear Clive's comments on production versus consumption emissions. Oh, gosh. And just really wondering how the Treasury would consider the energy-intensive industries that can be easily outsourced, because it's very easy to just offshore your emissions and still keep using the products, rather than working to develop genuinely net zero or low-carbon industries.
Okay, and then I was moving across. Okay, do you want to, sorry, you have to run around. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Leslie Rudd from the Sustainable Energy Association. Just a question really about the Green Book. Just interested to know more about what's going to happen with that, because we deal with BEIS and DEFRA and people regularly, pretty much every day, but we have less interaction with Treasury than we'd really like. and find it a bit more difficult to get through to them on things like retrofitting your houses, insulation, low carbon, decarbonising our homes. And we find Treasury sometimes less willing to engage. I was at an event earlier where I was told that the Green Book, as far as transport is concerned, we're moving away from that, and apparently there's an extra toolkit, and the Green Book rules aren't applying to transport. Is there any chance that that's going to happen with housing? And also, just to say, public sector needs to lead the way. I agree with people saying things about that, social housing in particular.
Okay, and we'll take one more in this round, and we'll try and get another round after that. I'll take the person here.
Yes, my name is Eileen Rowbotham. I come from the Dover and Deal constituency. I'm actually a member of, on and off, over the years, of 7 of those organisations. It was in the mid-80s I actually invited a speaker from SERA down to our constituency, and I've been a supporter on and off, well, 35 years, longer. And it's good to remind people that we are older than actually the Green Party. It's a shame more of them didn't actually join the Labour Party, but that's another story. My question is, we've got to make sure that when we get a Labour government, they legislate builders and developers that we build to the very latest standard, not going back to a standard that was 5 or 6 years ago, but the very latest standard of today, even, as it develops and comes out. We've recently built a new house. We've got, photovoltaic? And to see that going into the house and the electricity meter almost stopping is amazing. And that should be automatic on every house that's being built, on every adaptation to public buildings, schools, hospitals. It should just be a given.
Excellent questions we have there, and just a plug for our housing event tomorrow, which are looking at that very issue. So please come along. But we can have some answers to some of these questions. So we've got energy-intensive industries. We've got more about the Green Book. We've had about housing, and we had about nationalising energy. I think I might take Clive on the nationalising point.
On nationalising, which nationalising?
So that was the first
What
point.
are we nationalising? What next?
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, I've made some notes. I can just jump through. I think in terms of the issue about outsourcing, I mean, I did touch on that. If we move to a consumption-based target, it means that basically all of our internal production plus the things that we're importing from other countries and what we're exporting then all get factored into what our carbon budget actually is. And I think once you've actually got your metrics correct, you can then begin to appropriate the right response in terms of the policy level responses that you're going to put into place. Once we move on to that level of understanding, I think you then begin to see just how big a decarbonisation programme we need. It's beyond the scale of anything that I think the current economic model that is accepted can deliver. But because this is an existential threat, I think that gives us an extra impetus to be able to convince people that we can move down that path. In terms of homes being built, I'm really proud to say, as an MP for Norwich, that we have just built the best homes in the country. That's not me boasting about that as a Norwich MP, but that's just had an award at the Labour Party, the Guardian Award on housing, and a number of other awards. And those are sustainable homes. I think the average energy bill each year is £50. Okay? So that's the standard that we would expect. Do I think Persimmon and Wimpey are going to build those homes? No, I don't. And to be quite frank, we're probably going to have to see a revolution in how we conduct house building, because that programme is probably going to be one of the biggest, and it's also one of the easiest in some ways, in terms of the public imagination, about saying your home will be retrofitted, your energy bills will come down. The new homes that we're going to build are going to be a zero carbon standard. Your energy bill will be £50 a year. Fuel poverty will be a thing that your children read about in the history books. I think that's a policy that we could all sell, and it's one that I think most people would buy into. In terms of what we're going to do, the contracts of difference, is public ownership a distraction? I think we can do both. I mean, look, I know that one of the policy reviews that we've raised in the Shadow Treasury team is we want to see a root and branch review of all Treasury policies against the test of delivering 20%. annual carbon reductions throughout the coming decades. So that means a review of the carbon floor price, the climate change levy, the emissions trading scheme, the carbon reduction commitment, the landfill tax and aggregate levy, the renewables obligation, the contracts for difference, feed-in tariffs, the energy efficiency obligation, smart meters, the warm home discount. We want a review of all of them. Some of them are going to be scrapped, some of them are going to be pushed out of the way, but we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is joined up and actually working towards the objective that we want. At the moment, there's a lot of flaff out there. We want to get rid of that and make sure that we've got a single laser-like focus on delivering what that next Labour government needs to do.
Fanny, do you want to
I'd like to come in on a few points. One is, I think, a theme that keeps coming up is this risk that we will be divided on climate change like we're divided on Brexit. Just to say, at the moment, the polls say the opposite. We are divided on Brexit, we're not divided on climate change. And that's a really exciting opportunity for the whole country to move forward, I think. And actually what Extinction Rebellion has done surprised us in that it has taken the middle ground with them. The Overton window has moved. But I think there's no question that when people realise that the level of change that's required, that we absolutely need to make them understand that that's going to be good for them. So I think that, you know, the idea of getting people to feel that PV is amazing and that their energy bills are going to be cheaper and that wind power is actually likely to start reducing the cost of electricity, those are the messages we have to get out there to convince the unconvinced and to take people with us. And absolutely, getting over the hump with the technologies that haven't had the support that renewables had is going to require public money, and it's going to require that money to be spent particularly in areas where people are going to need support to be able to get on board with this transition. Totally agree on that. Just on the last point about outsourcing, the other thing that we are outsourcing is the destruction of nature. The food system is a massive destroyer of nature, and most of that is happening not actually in the Amazon. We don't import very much food from the Amazon, but there are other ecosystems worldwide that are currently being absolutely destroyed by the food that we eat. And we don't see it, we don't know where it is, because it's often the soy that is fed to the chicken that we eat that is complete, you know, it's hidden. We're going to be campaigning a lot on that, but we think that you know, that whoever gets into power next, and certainly what we would love is for parties to have on their manifesto, that a response to the Amazon fires saying, we are going to have due diligence legislation that forces companies to know what they're importing and to know whether it's deforested, and then we can move towards ending that in our food. Because it should be like, for us, it's like, for me, it's like horse meat. I don't want horse meat anywhere in my food. I don't want deforestation anywhere in my food, and that's something that government can do.
Thank you very much. I might bring in Martha in a minute, but I'm just going to take, and maybe on the Green Book as well, we've answered that a bit, but I want to take 4 more questions if I can fit it, and they will probably be the final questions, because we do need to finish by 4:15. Right, I saw some people over there, so I'll take those 2 people there, and then those 2 there.
Okay, I've been asked to be short and sweet. My name's Sarah Lunnan. I'm a coordinator for Extinction Rebellion. I'm also ex-Green Party county councillor. And one thing that worries me listening to you guys here, although Clive outlined really well the problem we're facing, we've got 3 years left of a carbon budget, is the philosophy that by taking action, we're going to make our lives better. And that's, for me, one of the failures of the Green Party was that we sold our policies along the lines of this is going to make your lives better. When you're facing an emergency, the requirement to act is to stop the devastation that's going to happen, not that it's going to make your lives better. And I cannot see any way in the future that our lives are going to be better. So are you actually falling into the same trap as the Green Party has done and all the other environmental organisations?
Yeah, my name's Evie Sear. I want to ask Clive, as a Shadow Treasury Minister, about whether Labour would commit to backing 5% of public spending to go towards tackling the climate emergency. This is the minimum amount that we, along with Greenpeace, with other NGOs, have calculated needs to be spent in the near future. Also, just on a side, I've got solar panels on my roof. I had them put in just before the tariffs went down. I think I get 45% or something, and my energy bills are really low. So I don't understand why the budget got cut or anything. So anyway, that was just a side bit.
Okay. And we're going to take that person there. Oh.
Hi there. Just very quickly, I wanted to ask at what level Labour Treasury would set the carbon price and why?
what level would you set the carbon price? And it actually came up earlier today in terms of, you know, it's not set on meeting net zero at the moment. And, yeah.
Jack Dobson-Smith from the Solar Trade Association. We've got currently there are 12 billion euros in subsidies going towards fossil fuels. We have CFDs for offshore wind, but onshore wind and solar are shut out. No more subsidies for solar, and now we're seeing 20% VAT for combined solar and storage, whilst domestic fossil fuels remain at 5%. Clive, I'm sure you already answered this question earlier, but what needs to happen within Treasury to produce a level playing field?
Right. We've got a range of questions there. I might start with Fanny first. And there's lots. I mean, we heard them, you know, should we be doom-mongers and tell everyone it's awful? You know, a bit about the solar industry, carbon price. So
I'm going to just take on the Extinction Rebellion challenge first. I'm a massive fan of the movement. I think it's incredibly powerful, and I think that scaring people and telling the truth, as you say, about the problem is absolutely right. I also do believe that life would be better with more nature, that life would be better with super insulation in poor people's homes, that life would be better if we were generating all of our power from renewable sources and creating amazing jobs. I do believe in that future, I genuinely do. I think that what we need to be honest with people is that it's a redeployment of resource, that we need to do that urgently, and there's going to be some difficult choices, and I don't know whether we're really into those difficult choices as a country yet. I think we're just starting to realise this is a massive urgent issue, and I think we're going to have to get people to fall in love with the idea of surviving climate change and the future that can build for them. And that will get us over the hump. But there's no doubt that there is some difficult stuff, not least with the impacts of climate change, which we know we can't stop. On the other issues, I mean, basically, I think that, you know, Clive's point of the Green Book as a computer that you want to get different answers out of is the critical thing. We've got to be able to say we need to support all kinds of renewables. We need to support particularly the massive programme of insulation and different kinds of energy and heating in people's houses. That's going to have to require government funding, and we need a different answer from that Green Book computer.
And Martha, we talked a bit about some of the numbers that might be, you know, knocking around, and then also how it's told to people. When you talked about missions, you know, that is about achieving some real social goods, long-term social goods. How do you see that squaring? And maybe that's a pathway through to explaining what we need to do ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that we need to be realistic about the climate emergency and the inherent urgency that comes with it, but also demonstrate that there are elements that people haven't even necessarily considered about how their lives could be better or could be changed. The idea of a city centre without cars or with electric vehicles, the idea of rewilding and spending more time in nature. These are areas that people often don't even consider. They jump straight to the idea that they will have to give something up. And whilst we may have to give up certain things, there's also elements of life that can be better, and I completely agree with Fanny on that. It's also the case that when you start framing things in terms of long-term missions that are framed around inclusive growth rather than a green transition that gets us back to the same economic kind of landscape that we currently have, with some people having much and some people having less, those kind of missions bring people along the way to try and want to tackle climate change and to want to have their own stake and to do their own piece, to put together their own piece of the puzzle. So I don't think we should be only framing the climate crisis in terms of fear and in terms of loss, although that is an element that is currently in public debate, and I think it's really interesting that it is finally kind of being talked about like that. But fear alone doesn't get us to the transition we need. Instead, you do have to find these opportunities for new industries and for different ways of living within the difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves as a society. And yeah, I completely agree. The idea of framing the Green Book as an input-output computer is something that I think is a really interesting way of kind of characterizing it. Thinking about things like the contracts for difference and the megawatt per hour that we're at in terms of renewable energy, that's an example of where something like using carbon prices in a very kind of imaginative way that kind of calculates in the dynamic and difficult to predict future energy prices with levels of magnitude that we can't necessarily think through at the moment, is really important to include those kinds of calculations within as we kind of look forward in carbon pricing.
And just before I come to Clive, I was just going to sort of say, I think, and Clive touched on this, if we aren't about hope, then it's a very bleak world, and I think the Labour Party's always been about hope, and that is what SERA has been about, is bringing hope through and marrying together social justice and the environment and ambitious environmental policy. And I think that is what we've tried to get across, that actually an environmental change can bring many benefits. Thank you to the colleague from Dover and Deal who just left, but she, I think, gave an example of the benefits of the transition. There will be tough choices ahead, but I think for all of us in this room, we're all interested in these areas, we're all concerned, and everyone outside, it's all of us to think, and picking up Lisa's point, who's not here, but I think she made a value point, how do we bring as many people with us as possible and build the broadest coalition? And I think that's all, must be all in our minds as we do this, because things are going to be tough, but it's a lot better if we're saying, here is a better world and some benefits that come from these changes.
I can I just obviously kind of come off the back of that and say that I'm often accused by colleagues of being somewhat pessimistic and a bit of a doom monger, but when you're around the scientists and the activists, you do become pessimistic. But hope. There's a really fantastic quote in June, which is that basically that hope is something which we set ourselves to basically abate the fear of the future. Look, hope was in Pandora's box. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It was left in there, lingering, didn't quite jump out. I think, look, power concedes nothing without demand. I think as a political party, we have to offer hope. I can't go onto the doorstep and say, hey, Clive Lewis, local Labour Party, we're fucked. I could, but I'm probably not going to be coming back to Parliament. So look, power concedes nothing without demand, and I think there's a good cop, bad cop routine here, which is that the political parties need to pursue an agenda of hope, but I think actually the climate movement, the public, need to, the Extinction Rebellion, and all the others, the climate youth strikers, need to be pushing from the other side, because I'm afraid to say, as politicians, we would always do, or tend to do, through the political institutions and the powers that be, the corporations, the financial institutions, they will push back against us. We need you behind us pushing. And I think it's those two things. You can be pessimistic. We have to offer hope, but you have to say you need to be moving faster and quicker. And that's what will make that change happen in the timescales we need. But I think we can offer both. We can offer hope, and you can offer the big stick, carrot and stick. In terms of renewables and the level playing fields, look, it's quite clear. Since 2017, we've seen a 55% reduction in investment in renewables. There needs to be a Treasury policy review. Anything which undermines renewables should either be revoked or amended. There's no two ways about it. We just have to get that. It's just a no-brainer on that one. In terms of the carbon price, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what that price is going to be. What I will say is two things. One, carbon pricing isn't the solution to climate change and ecological destruction. It's one of the tools that we could use, but I think there has been a disproportionate reliance for market mechanisms to deliver everything we need, and we are now beyond that. Back maybe in 2001 when Stern gave his report and 1% carbon reductions, annual carbon reductions, maybe then. But here, now, no. We're going to need a lot more. Carbon pricing will be part of the armoury, but it's not the only solution. And I'll tell you why. It's a little thought experiment here. There is something quite unsettling about carbon pricing, because basically a group of mainly probably old white men will sit in a room and determine what that price is. And what you're in effect doing is putting a price on the lives of people in the developing world who are dying now because of climate change. I'm not saying don't have one, but you need to think it through. And finally, in terms of the 5% commitment, in terms of tax and spend, fiscal policies are going to be important. I've just produced a paper which is looking at this issue. But I think it's quite clear, we are not going to be able to tax our way out of this hole. We're going to have to borrow. And I'm afraid to say, fiscal policy alone will not solve this. So we're talking about green bonds, and we're talking about, in effect, the Green New Deal will be about democratizing our financial system. For 40 years now, or more, we have had an economic system which has been controlled undemocratically by a cabal of people in Wall Street and the City of London. And they decide where capital flows go. That has to end, and we have to democratize our financial system. Because if we don't, we will go off that cliff edge. So I think borrowing, from the state borrowing is part of that, but I also think how we direct those financial flows of the private sector also is a question that we have to ask ourselves, because as it's currently going, it's not working. And the last point I will make, if you look at what Roosevelt did back in the 1930s, he wasn't a communist, he wasn't even a socialist. He was a New Deal Democrat, a Democrat in the United States. In his first day in office, he basically abolished the gold standard, took back control of the exchange rate mechanism, introduced the Glass-Steagall Act, which put limits on speculative banking and borrowing, and basically was only taken off and basically repealed by Ronald Reagan and on the equivalent by Margaret Thatcher in this country, which then set us up for the conditions of the 2008 financial crash. What Roosevelt did, if he could do that in the 1930s and probably avert America from following Europe down the road of fascism, then surely we can do something similar now in the 21st century on the brink and cliff edge of climate change and ecological destruction. Emergency socialism. There you go.
Thank you, everyone. That draws things to a close. Thank you once again to our partners of the event, Greener UK. And we've got another event in here in 4:30 on air quality. So we're turning it round, and we're going to hear about some mayors on that. So if you want to leave not staying, please leave quickly. Thank you very much for coming, and come to more events.